You remember the stone. You remember the shout. You remember a young man standing over a fallen giant, the camp roaring, the enemy routed. But beneath that familiar scene lies a darker, quieter thread, a string of encounters and names that keep appearing in the margins of the narrative, as if the battle had not ended with one struck forehead. What if Goliath's death was only the beginning of a feud that kept surfacing across generations? And what if another witness, an Ethiopian tradition preserved in parts of the wider Christian corpus, remembers those echoes differently, nudging us to ask, is this a story of revenge or of redemption? Enter with the heart of a seeker. The Bible gives us a visible climax in Goliath's fall, then it turns its eyes to smaller, grimmer scenes, men with spears like poles, near misses that almost snuff out Israel's light, and warriors who finish what a king's hand cannot. These scenes cluster in a short but dense passage in 2 Samuel 21. Read closely and you see a pattern. The enemies who once towered over Israel do not vanish with one stone. They return in descendants, in monstrous strength, in the brittle memory of a city called Gath. The question the ancient text poses, and the question echoed sometimes differently in Ethiopian manuscript traditions, is whether the cycle recorded there is driven by ancestral vengeance, a blood feud that must be avenged, or whether it marks the slow, providential closing of an era, a fulfillment of covenant that redeems what violence began. To understand the stakes, we need a quick map. Gath was one of the principal Philistine cities, a place of fearsome reputation in the Bible. Archaeology has revealed layers of fortification there, and artifacts suggesting significant craft, including evidence of iron use and weapons that appear heavier than what we expect for Bronze Age skirmishes. That material context does not prove myth, but it suggests a setting where martial prowess and superior armament would leave a mark on the memory of Israel's neighbors. When the biblical writers speak of giants, the Raphim, Anakim, and in older tradition the Nephilim, they are naming a cultural category that explains why some foes seemed larger than life, why their clubs and armor are described with the language of excess. These terms carry memory, myth, and historical grit all at once. Raphim can denote remnants of an older, imposing lineage. Anakim are the Anakites, legendary tall people in the highlands. Nephilim is a more enigmatic term from older strata of the text. All of these names are interpretive lenses, not airtight ethnography. And then the narrative narrows. In 2 Samuel 21 we meet Ishbi-Benob, described as one of the descendants of the giant from Gath, who took up a spear and nearly killed King David. The image is jarring. David, once young and glorious on the battlefield, older now, his vigor diminished, faces a death that is almost personal. It is Abishai, David's nephew and loyal warrior, who intervenes and saves him. After that tense rescue, the text records several other confrontations. The account names a man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a description that signaled extraordinary physical anomaly to ancient readers. It names Elhanan as the killer of Lahmi, identified in the text as the brother of the giant from Gath, and it attributes a separate killing to Jonathan son of Shimeah. There are variations between Samuel and Chronicles on who did precisely what, and that textual complexity is itself part of the story. Memory preserved differently, details reordered by tradition. Pause on Ishbi-Benob for a moment. The text does not present him as a faceless enemy. He is a descendant of a line, with a spear, weighing 300 shekels of bronze in some descriptions, a way of saying he wielded a weapon far heavier than ordinary, the kind of imagery that underlines his extraordinary strength. He comes at David like the rising of an old feud, an attempt to finish what the past began. That attempt nearly succeeds. The king's lamp flickers. Here the narrative's drama is theological, not merely military. The symbol of Israel's leadership, the one through whom God has worked, is at risk. The rescue by Abishai is not just battlefield heroism, it is a providential interlude in which the covenantal order is preserved for the moment. That near miss is crucial because, from then on, David himself appears less central to the destruction of these giants. The task moves to others, to the next wave of men who will close the account. The pattern shifts from a solitary hero's initiative to a generational completion. The youthful slaying of Goliath becomes the opening act. The closing acts are performed by David's men and successors. That narrative movement invites an interpretive question. Are these later slayings driven by vengeance, a familial vendetta rippling through Philistine bloodlines and answered in kind by Israel? Or are they the slow execution of a divine arc in which the covenant is preserved not by individual bravado but by a communal generational faithfulness that finishes what the first act began? If you find this angle surprising, leave a comment below. Did you know the story continued in this way? The rest of the biblical text gives us more texture to decide. 2 Samuel 21 does not present the follow-up encounters as mindless cycles of reprisal. They are narrated within a framework of covenantal concern. The initial episode in the chapter, the famine in Israel for 3 years, is linked theologically to Saul's earlier violation of the Gibeonites. Voices in the text are concerned with sin, reparation, and the maintenance of the covenant community. Thus, the giant encounters are not framed merely as vendettas. They occur in a theological landscape where God's purposes, Israel's sins, and the obligations of leadership all intersect. That theological frame nudges readers toward a reading of completion and restoration rather than endless revenge. Yet the imagery of bloodlines and brothers remains compelling. The idea that Goliath had kin, brothers, sons, descendants, carries the motif of family honor and familial retaliation. In many ancient Near Eastern cultures, blood debt and honor were real, operative forces. The biblical narrative does not happily endorse revenge, but it does not erase the reality that ancestral identity can motivate violence across generations. Thus, a dual movement exists in the text: the reality of a persistent threat grounded in lineage, and the theological drive toward closure rooted in covenant faithfulness. Textual witnesses complicate and enrich the picture. The Masoretic text, Septuagint and Chronicles do not line up on every detail. 2 Samuel 21:19, in some Hebrew manuscripts reads ambiguously enough that later editors and translators wrestled with whether Elhanan killed Goliath himself or Lahmi, the brother of Goliath. 1 Chronicles attempts to harmonize these variants by assigning the deed to Jonathan, son of Shimeah. These discrepancies do not undermine the central thesis. They show how communities remembered and reshaped these episodes. They also point us to an important methodological caution. Differences in the biblical record are not invitations to build sensational theories, but clues about how tradition handled difficult or embarrassing phrases. At this point we must introduce another witness: the Ethiopian tradition. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves a broader canon and a range of manuscript traditions that sometimes preserve variant readings and additional stories. Some elements found in Ethiopian literature, such as expanded angelologies, traditions about giants, and books like 1 Enoch and Jubilees included in the broader Ethiopian corpus, can offer alternative lenses on ancient memories of extraordinary beings. That said, specific claims about Goliath's brother in Ethiopian manuscripts or a detailed Ethiopian recounting of the 2 Samuel 21 episodes are not uniformly attested in the sources available to me here. Therefore, any detailed reconstruction of an Ethiopian variant is indefinido. What can be responsibly said is this: Ethiopian manuscript traditions in some cases preserve or emphasize different theological or narrative nuances, sometimes magnifying themes of divine judgment, sometimes accenting moral correction, and sometimes underscoring providential closure. Those tendencies can color how an Ethiopian reading community might perceive the giant episodes, perhaps seeing them less as a blood feud and more as the fulfillment of divine justice and the preservation of the covenant. But we must be careful. Describing such a tendency is not the same as asserting that every Ethiopian text says so. Treat these traditions as variant witnesses, valuable for what they reveal about reception history, not as definitive replacements for the Hebrew or Greek textual streams. Return to the battlefield. The later episodes in 2 Samuel 21 emphasize several things that shape interpretation. 1. The extraordinary physicality of the foes, heavy spears, oversized armor, extra digits, marks them as belonging to a category that transcends ordinary warfare. Whether those descriptions should be read literally, symbolically, or as hyperbolic memory is an interpretive choice, the text allows for multiple readings. 2. The heroes who confront these foes are David's men, Abishai, Elhanan, Sibbecai, and others like Jonathan, son of Shimeah. Their bravery is communal, rooted in the king's household and the continuity of military duty. 3. The narrative placement of these offerings, between a famine and a return to normalcy, indicates that these clashings are part of a larger story about Israel's health as a people, not merely a series of duels. That broader context leads to a theological pivot: the preservation of the lamp of Israel. David's near death at the hands of Ishbi-Benob is not merely an episode of personal misfortune. It symbolizes how fragile leadership and national destiny can be. The rescue by Abishai rescues not only a life but what David represents: the torch of covenant history, the line through which promises are mediated. Because David survives, the future of Israel remains intact, and subsequent generations can complete the task of rooting out those who would undo God's order. In that sense, the narrative offers a robust image of redemption. The community, sustained by covenantal maintenance and righteous action, continues the work that one hero began. But acknowledging the redemptive arc does not erase the reality of vengeance motifs. The text retains the feel of hostile continuity. Clans of giants posing recurring threats, possibly motivated by kinship ties binding them to past humiliations. Memory and honor culture are real, and the biblical text does not sanitize the violence. Instead, it reframes the violence within the economy of covenant so that acts of force are read against the backdrop of divine judgment and preservation. That dialectic explains why readers across centuries can find both strands in the story, the appetite for retaliation and the deeper narrative of God bringing closure and re-establishing order. Archaeology contributes a modest but useful texture here. Discoveries at sites such as Gath reveal substantial fortifications and material culture that indicates a people capable of organized warfare and complex metallurgy. Philistine ironworking and imported crafts suggest that arms could be heavier and more formidable than Israelite tradition sometimes assumes. Scholars point out that these finds are suggestive. They indicate a milieu in which stories of formidable enemies would not be implausible. But archaeology does not vindicate mythic particulars about giants, it simply provides a plausible stage on which the biblical actors perform. When the text speaks of heavy bronze spears and imposing shields, the material record allows listeners to hear those claims without dismissing them outright as impossible. The interplay between revenge and redemption becomes most acute when we follow the movement of agency in the narrative. Goliath's defeat is a personalized, cinematic victory. The later accounts distribute agency across a community. Why that narrative choice? Partly because it reframes the locus of divine action, not as the preservation of one charismatic warrior, but as the survival of a people bound by covenantal commitments. The finishing work, the last confrontations with giant descendants, belongs to the communal memory and to ordinary men who embody continuity. That shift suggests the biblical authors were less interested in perpetuating a saga of endless vengeance than in narrating how God's purposes finish an epoch through the instruments of fidelity. If we return to the Ethiopian lens one more time, cautiously, we can imagine how a tradition that emphasizes communal memory and apocalyptic closure might read these episodes. Ethiopian Christian literature, with its robust angelology and concern for cosmic order, could easily interpret these giant episodes as part of a larger drama of restoration. Again, whether any specific Ethiopian manuscript narrates these events in detail or with unique variations is indefinido. What we can affirm is that Ethiopian witnesses often function as interpretive partners. They preserve alternative emphases, highlight moral or spiritual dimensions, and invite readers to see the biblical past through a different canonical horizon. Treat them as parallel commentaries rather than superior or secret sources. So which reading is closer to the text, revenge or redemption? The most faithful answer is both and neither. Revenge language and kinship dynamics are present and real. The possibility of ancestral vengeance furnishes much of the narrative tension. Yet the theological frame, the placement of these episodes within Israel's covenantal history, and the way agency shifts to communal actors, tilt the interpretive scale toward redemption and closure. The story's design appears to be less about endlessly replicating vendetta than about bringing a dangerous epoch to an end through the perseverance of covenantal life. There is also a pastoral dimension here for modern readers. These ancient episodes ask us to consider how memory and lineage shape our conflicts. Many of us inherit quarrels, grudges, and structural violence we did not choose. The biblical sequence of Goliath, then Ishbi-Benob's near-fatal blow, then the final slayings names a spiritual dynamic. Violence may reappear, but it does not have the final word if covenantal faithfulness, communal repentance, reparation, sustained fidelity, intervenes. That is a hard word for communities tempted by cycles of retaliation. It is a hopeful word for those who believe that history can be redirected by prayerful collective resolve. There are also interpretive cautions worth repeating. Do not make literalistic leaps from a phrase like giant to grandiose theories about supernatural hybrid beings that survived the flood. Do not treat textual variants as signs of conspiracy. They are the work of honest transmission and differing memory. And when considering Ethiopian traditions, do not assume uniformity across a vast corpus. The Ethiopian witness is diverse, and specific claims must be verified against actual manuscripts rather than assumed. At the heart of the story, however, remains a vivid image. An aging king brought to the brink by a descendant of a defeated foe. A nephew who risks everything to preserve the king. A sequence of men who lay down their lives to finish a job begun earlier. The lamp of Israel wavers, but is not extinguished. The narrative that begins with a stone ends with a community fulfilling its responsibility. That arc is, in its best reading, an image of redemption. Not merely the erasure of a foe, but the restoration of covenantal life through generations. We close with a question that brings us back to the title. When you read the hidden messages of Goliath's brother, whether in the Hebrew text, in the variant readings, or through the nuanced echoes found in other traditions such as some Ethiopian manuscripts, indefinito in specifics, do you see a cycle of revenge or a story of covenantal completion? The text sits between both impulses. It refuses simple closure while offering a profound resolution. Violence does not have the final say. Fidelity pursued attentively by a people and by God can finish what force only began. If this journey through shadowed verses has stirred you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Tell us which side of the question you lean toward, and whether Ethiopian traditions shift your view. Thank you for tracing these forgotten threads with care and reverence. May the lamp that nearly dimmed continue to guide reflection and faithful action.